let me please warmly welcome Wulf Kansteiner. And I'm, if you don't mind, going to switch to Czech. Dobré ráno všem. Je mi velmi příjemnou povinností přivítat Wulfa Kansteinera, aktuálně působícího v Dánsku na Ruské univerzitě, aby konferenci zahájil. Wulf Kansteiner je velmi pronikavým a viditelným myslitelem, jedním z těch, kteří jsou hlavními postavami celého pole paměťových studií, spoluzakladatelem časopisu Memory Studies, aktuálně třeba připravuje s kolektivem autorů jako editor Handbook of Historical Memory, který vyjde za 3 roky. A proto se nám zdálo, to je jeden z důvodů, proč se nám zdálo, že je velmi příhodné, aby konferenci otevřel a nějak to pole uvedl. Wulf Kansteiner je však v tom diskurzu kolem paměťových studií postavou velmi rozeznatelnou a zvláštní, protože do něj přináší hodně kritických a netypických podnětů, takže já zvlášť mám rád jeden jeho text už z roku 2002, který se v té diskuzi stal velice důležitým a který upozornil na nedostatky, zejména metodologické nedostatky práce s pamětí. Ten text se jmenuje Finding Meaning in Memory, a methodological critique of collective memory studies. Velice doporučuji jeho četbu. Podobně tak doporučujeme četbu i dalších textů a o jednom z nich se budeme bavit v pátek. Kdo jste se nestihli přihlásit na workshop s Wulfem Kansteinerem, který bude následovat po de facto zakončení konference, tak je to dost pravděpodobně ještě možné. A měl bych také zmínit, že Wulf Kansteiner je velmi vtipný člověk, takže souhlasil s tím, že budu mít úvod v češtině, abych mohl bez toho, aby mě kontroloval a držel nade mnou nějakou autoritu jeho dílo kritizovat nebo na něj osobně nadávat. Já jsem bohužel žádnou nadávku úplně nevymyslel, nicméně bych upozornil na to, že Wulf Kansteiner není pouze odborníkem, uznávaným odborníkem v paměťových studiích, ale velmi detailně se zabývá vizuálními médii a jejich vztahem ke kulturní paměti a také holocaustem a vzpomínáním na holocaust, historiografií holocaustu jako nějakým ústředním motivem, který podle něj zásadně spoluurčuje, mimo to, že má samozřejmě hodnotu samou o sobě, tak spolu určuje módy vzpomínání, to, co je přípustné ve vzpomínání a podobně. Tahle všechna témata plus ještě některé další se pokusí propojit v své úvodní přednášce. Já nebudu prozrazovat žádnou z point, a moc se těším, že se podaří snad vytvořit nějaký sdílený prostor, ke kterému se budeme moct i v dalších panelech a v průběhu konference vztahovat, ale zatímco Wulf teď nerozumí mě, tak bude rozumět vám, protože bude mít překlad a značnou část dneška tady stráví, takže mi říkal, že by bylo klidně možné a vhodné, kdybyste měli chuť se s ním o přestávkách pobavit, tak by měl mít přehled o tom, co tady padlo a být jaksi v obraze. Takže děkuji moc Wulfovi za to, že jsem vážil z Arhusu dlouhou cestu vlakem a že je ochoten tady s námi několik dní strávit a prosil bych ho o jeho úvodní přednášku. Thank you very much, Wulf, for coming. We are really delighted and thrilled to hear a keynote, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the hopefully nice introduction. I'm glad to be here. I certainly appreciate being invited here and having a chance to talk to you. I have a relatively ambitious plan for today. Also in light of the program, I adjust my talk a little bit, and I want to cover two big chunks, two big chapters, and then an appendix. The whole goal is to come to an understanding of where we are at the moment in terms of memory politics, where we are in terms of the media ecology that is supporting our memory culture in the West, but also beyond that. There's a couple of hypotheses that I would like to try to test on you. One of them is that different media ecologies have different memory strengths. So there were some media ecologies that were, for example, very well suited for problematic bystander memory. There are other memory ecologies that are much better to problematize questions of complicity. I think this will become clearer in the course of my talk. And then I would like to, that's another hypothesis, to argue that we're looking at a shift from the active construction of memory culture to the active construction of forgetting. And that's one of the most important shifts that takes place from an analog media environment to a highly digitized one. So that's the two chapters I'm talking about. First, to try to outline how we have come to our more or less common Western memory. And then, of course, in this case, the memory of World War II, the memory of the Holocaust is a focus. And then how just in the last few years, as a result of many political activities and as a result of shifts in our communication technology, our memory culture is moving in a very different direction, I would suggest. That's my hypothesis at the moment. And at the very end, I like to develop some speculations about the way that artificial intelligence is posed to change our memory culture. That's the little appendix. Good. So far so good. I also want to thank the translators, hoping that I'm speaking within a speed that's manageable and not moving too much around so that my talk also can be captured. Let's begin with the media ecology that sets a benchmark after 1945. Visuality becomes extremely important. One of the key decisions of the Allied as they are embarking on a campaign to reorganize the continent and to reorganize and craft memory, one of the decisions is to work visually. It's almost a gut-felt response that many Allied leaders have, that this, what happened in the camps, different camps, has to be seen. It has to be seen first and foremost by the German population. That's, for example, in the context of forced visits to liberated camps. Has to be also watched by the population in often also heavily induced visits to media events like the Death Mill documentary. And these events, despite the fact that they are then abandoned relatively quickly, they set a visual benchmark. And they set an idea of the power of images, and more specifically, I would argue, the power of explicit images. So, from the get-go, this idea to respond to what at that point in time was the biggest catastrophe, was perceived as the biggest catastrophe in Western history, from the get-go, the idea was a visual, a visceral, a powerful, and in that sense, quite violent response. Right? And the audiences were across the globe. So you have, for example, German audiences subject to re-education, but you also have audiences in many other places. Here, for example, an American audience, very important. The visual element should prove to them why it was so important to intervene in World War II from the American point of view, where a lot of people were quite hesitant to deploy troops. and to get engaged. So that kind of visuality, that graphicness, is part and parcel. It's one of the points of departure and becomes a very important point of the established memory. Now that memory is not established in 1945. It doesn't yet have a narrative framing. It doesn't yet, Holocaust of course as an event doesn't exist. The narrative frames of the post-war years are anti-totalitarianism, communism. Those are frames where the mass murder of the Jewish population is simply not the focus yet, also not as a result of the Nuremberg trial. One of the first moments where then that shifts, but only temporarily, is, as you know, the Eichmann trial, which only temporarily in many countries puts focus on the murder of European Jewry, shifts the memory culture decisively in Israel, but for example not decisively in Germany, and also, I would also argue, not decisively in the United States. And here, what happened in the Eichmann trial, for example, is that the visuality, the concreteness of the images of atrocity already in circulation since 1945 are now linked to survivor testimony. And that survivor testimony shifts the debate in Israel, and it also creates biographical focal points for a memory in evolution. Now, the memory we're knowing today, the memory that has been firmly established in Europe, is again not a memory that exists in the early 1960s, at the time of the Eichmann trial. The focus is still not in existence. Now, another point here is that visual culture is of course also implicated in the catastrophe, and lots of people were quite aware of that. They were very aware of the fact that the Nazis had been fabulous at manipulating images, in that sense also fabulous at creating memories. And a lot of visual culture after 1945, especially in the 1960s, is a response to try to prevent, to try to create a different visual code for the construction of memories of World War II and implicitly, explicitly also the Holocaust, in order to try to not have the images that were successful as propaganda. So I would summarize that as an attempt to create an anti-immersive visual code. Now, in that anti-immersive visual code, specifically on the left, the explicitness of the images is called massively into question. So some of the first media events that try to capture, try to understand what happened, for example, at the sites of extermination, like Night and Fog, the documentary from the 1950s already, is one that is eluding graphic images of violence. And similar things can be said, for example, about the new German cinema, the Nouvelle Vague, and other intellectual visual languages that try to set a counterpoint. Incidentally, it's not just a counterpoint to Babelsberg, to the cinema of the Nazis, it's also a counterpoint, of course, to Hollywood, right? That's implicit in this movement. The technology that I find so intriguing, the technology that creates our Holocaust memory, the technology that creates the way that the European Union, the way that the United Nations and lots of other NGOs are today ritualizing Holocaust memory. That came into existence as a result of television. And television, I would argue, is a fantastic technology in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust. Why is that so? First of all, because it generates a stream of stereotypical figures and role models, right? So for example, these are, I would argue, the most important figures, the most important concepts of how people are positioned within that history by way of television, not just television, but explicitly television. So heroes, perpetrators, victims and bystanders become very concrete figures, the figures that people can then visit and interact with on the screen, if not on a daily basis, then almost on a weekly basis. And that's true across Europe, but it's especially true also in Germany, perhaps somewhat surprising. So a technology that's new in Europe has all the attractiveness of a new code, is extremely entertaining, and it has the added advantage that it duplicates the idea, the notion, you could say the ideology of bystanding. So what television does, there's an eerie, a disconcerting parallel between the ways that many contemporaries of the fascist period liked to imagine themselves during and after the fact. So there's an eerie parallel between these imaginations, for example, the imagination of not having been involved, right? And the technology itself that allows, again, people by way of television in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to revisit the past with a sense of watching it from a distance somewhat, from a safe distance, in the safety of their own home. So there is what I call the very active construction of passivity as the norm. Right? So they imagine themselves, they're watching these catastrophes unfold again and again on the screen, quite willingly actually, because it partially reinforces a memory of not having been part of the catastrophe. Right? A very nice bystanding position. So what I'm trying to say here is that the technology of memory, the technology that creates this memory, is never innocent. Right? And television is a fantastic technology to support these notions of non-involvement. And so this is the technology that creates our memory. That's the media event, right? That creates the very idea, the very notion of Holocaust. From the point of, from the beginning, it's what Michael Rothberg would call a multi-directional memory event. Holocaust, the American television series, as you know, was produced in response to a very successful other miniseries, the miniseries Roots. And German television, for example, the people who were then making the decisions, should we screen it or not, pointed to Roots and said, well, we screened Roots, we can now not screen Holocaust just because it's about us. And so the result was a stunning media event, a kind of media that has never repeated itself. A media event that laid the foundation to Holocaust studies as an academic field, and maybe even more important, I would argue, it laid the foundation to the field of memory studies. It simply wouldn't exist without this type of media event. And if you go to the German archives, even today, it's simply stunning. You know, I've studied especially the television discourse about World War II and the Holocaust. And if you look from the beginning of television in the late 50s and throughout the 60s and beyond, a program about contemporary history, about World War II, if it received 100 responses from viewers, it was quite successful. In this case, there are tens of thousands of people who poured out their hearts. And for the first time, you had a sense, if you go to the archives and read, for the first time, there was, on a significant, large basis, the German population looking back and understanding what they had done. Right? And this is the moment of the self-reflexive memory. This is the moment of self-critical memory. This is the moment of the kind of scripting of memory that Europe has embraced ever since. In memory studies, we have all kinds of concepts for it. The probably most important is the notion of cosmopolitan memory. Daniel Levy and Nathan Snyder have coined that phrase. It has been studied as a transnational event. We can use concepts like Astrid Al's traveling memory. I already mentioned Michael Rothberg's multidirectional memory. Prosthetic memory, Alison Landsberg. So we have a lot of the methodological, theoretical infrastructure of memory studies is also directly or indirectly actually linked to this media event. And since that point in time, it is consensus that in order to improve a society by way of memory, it has to visit its darkest moments. It has to visit, it has to go where it hurts. It has to try to reflect where society failed. That's the paradigm of Holocaust memory, and one doesn't have to agree with that, as we very forcefully learn at the moment. Again, there are lots of societies that are practicing much more conventional, heroic memory paradigms. That applies to Russian society. It certainly also applies to Chinese society, and we could argue the majority of the population of this globe is actually following other memory paradigms. But that's, so to speak, the Western concept, and that's what is institutionalized, for example, in a whole slew of media releases after Holocaust, after the media event. Schindler's List, of course, is one of the most well-known, but also politically enshrined, for example, in the 2000 declaration of the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust, now called the IRA framework. And then, of course, institutionalized in all kinds of memorials. Here, for example, the memorial in Berlin. And now we are in an interesting moment, because the interesting moment is, we haven't quite made the jump. So we don't know yet how to translate that memory, which is one that analog and electronic media, from a media landscape, we haven't found a recipe yet how to integrate that into a highly digital, much more interactive environment. And that might be a good thing. I mean, in terms of technology, it would be extremely easy to replicate Auschwitz, right? To replicate Auschwitz as a learning environment, as a VR environment, as a game. All of that is completely possible, but we're hesitating. There's nobody willing to take the risk at the moment. So we have a fabulously interesting situation. The most important, I would argue, the most important medium of historical reflection at the moment is gaming. And in that gaming environment, we do not have a single mainstream, compelling, ambitious Holocaust game. We have some games that are in the margins. We have some independent games that are trying to address the topic, and I'm quite aware of them, but we do not have a blockbuster mainstream game that addresses the question of the Holocaust, as, for example, the television series did in 1978-79. And that gap is quite interesting. So in all this, in this culture that is linked to graphic violence, we are pulling back from this step. Right? And that might be maybe for very good reasons. I don't know that, but it's noticeable that we are missing it. Now, so that's chapter one. That's where we are. That's where our institutions are. That's where we seek orientation. Cosmopolitan memory works fabulously well, for example, for providing orientation in the current setting, in the current setting of war. It works beautifully well to script the war in Ukraine as a cosmopolitan event, and it provides all the type of orientation I think that people need. But in many ways, our society and our media ecology is already somewhere else. Our concerns seem to be somewhere else, and those concerns are pointing away from the active scripting of history in a self-reflexive and explicit key towards the active scripting of forgetting. That is, trying to take topics, images out of circulation, and in that sense positively change the memory of populations. I want to just give very quickly address 4 recent examples, which all gravitate and all deal with questions of forgetting in one way or another, or at least taking out of circulation images and stories. But a very famous one, if you look at the media link to this, a very famous one is one of the first big censorship campaigns of Facebook in all its history was at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, because Facebook decided then to take a whole slew of Facebook pages out of circulation. So the whole idea is, we are complicit in the sense that we are advancing an anti-vaccination position, and we can't do that. We want people to forget about the anti-vaccination arguments that have no substance. And that kind of forgetting advances the well-being of the population. So it is about, forgetting in the here and now. Very similar initiatives apply to massive discussions about Instagram, and interesting enough, also legal attempts in post-Brexit UK. One of the first large-scale initiatives to enact new legal frameworks that are not subject to EU control was, for example, an attempt to introduce new legislation about pornography in the UK. The idea is, as has so often been raised about pornography, that representations of sexuality and sexual violence are linked, and that by changing the circulation of texts and images, pornographic texts and images, you have a chance of changing behavior. Right? So far this has failed, but the intention was very clear. And there are lots of other examples. Black Lives Matter, you can have an unbelievable amount of moments where changing memory culture, changing monuments has been identified as the recipe to change, for example, American society. And lastly, that also applies to Fridays for Future, where after some discussion at least, some of the biggest platforms have decided to no longer allow climate change deniers to make a profit on these platforms. So again, we are moving, and very, very rapidly so, we are moving into a realm of enhanced censorship practices for the purpose of improving society through forgetting. We're taking stories, images out of circulation in order to improve that society. That was unthinkable just 5 years ago. 5 years ago, the concepts of free speech and others would have made these types of interventions unthinkable. And at the moment, we're looking at highly centralized, and I would say very problematically, non-democratically legitimated campaigns of censorship as a way of inducing forgetting. And by the way, this is very interesting here. Of course, I'll do this also partly as a person working in Denmark, our most important Danish EU official. But these two initiatives, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, that's the response, that's the EU trying to respond. That's the EU trying to set paradigms of how the platform should be administered, who has power over content, and how our data are accessed and used fairly. So the EU is now, with this framework law, the EU is heavily invested in that business. And that business will have also extremely important consequences for researchers, because the idea, at least, is that we, for the first time, get access to the algorithms of the big platforms, so that we can actually trace, understand, criticize the way that content is moderated, as it's called in the language of the big platforms. So the players are now in place. And the players, of course, create some kind of bizarre associations, right? Bizarre associations, because once you start to embrace ideas of censorship, taking things out of circulation in order to induce forgetting, in order to improve society, you have very, very disconcerting bedfellows, right? I mean, I would argue at the moment, the most important censorship decisions are made in 2 geographical places. The absolute master of forgetting is China. The censorship efforts of Chinese, the digital censorship efforts are fabulously successful. Chinese society is a society where collective memory is created through forgetting. Research shows, for example, that Chinese society, vast parts of Chinese society have no functional memory of the Tiananmen Square massacre. Why? Because it doesn't exist, it doesn't circulate. And we know these examples. This is just one example, right? The very, very popular Chinese actress who has disappeared in 2021, right? She was cancelled completely. And I don't think the situation has changed. So these bedfellows are very disturbing. And I think that's important to remember when we embark on this idea of censorship, when we embrace censorship, when we embrace the idea of manipulating, changing our culture in order to change our memory, that we are in a disturbing company. What changes here? So what changes from the media ecology of the analog electronic age to our media ecology? The idea of past is different. What's at stake here is different pasts, right? The memory culture was very much focused on historical pasts, historical events, like wars, catastrophes. Now, we have accelerated, we recognize that memory and communication loops have highly accelerated. So we are talking about what I would call the daily past, the quotidian past, the past that's yesterday. That's already part of our memory culture. And the interference in that loop of reproduction is much, much faster. So we possibly are much less concerned with the historical past. We are much more concerned with what we have encountered in our social media feed yesterday and how that's changed. And that has linked to the fact that, for instance, time works very, very differently in electronic media and digital media. The sense of what was past and what is present is highly flexible and unstable in social media. Very important also, what has changed is the relationship in terms of censorship, a relationship between action and speech. In a classical liberal environment, there's a radical difference between acting violently and speaking violently. Speaking violently was in most cases supported by free speech. That's no longer the case. Right? We are now increasingly in a situation where we demand, where societies also demand from the platforms to censor violent speech, inaccurate speech. I mean, look at the recent developments in the United States, right? Where the famous media person who is negating mass shootings, mass school shootings, is now subject to extreme civil punishment. He's basically losing all his money. That type of decision is a very recent development. For most of his life, he could spew nonsense without any repercussions. That has changed now. We are actually in a new environment. So the Sandy Hook legal cases of recent months and weeks are indicative of the changed environment that we are facing, where it's the memory, denial of the memory, denial of the facticity of Sandy Hook is enough of a crime to be punished, and be punished severely. And maybe that's a good thing, I don't know that, but the change is stunning in our culture. Now, all of this happens in an environment where we don't know exactly how social media functions. It's not that we really know what social media do. There's a whole lot of different hypotheses about it. There's certainly, there's certainly hypotheses that the first hypothesis that social media have a positive impact on democratization. There is a hypothesis that we are encountering only ourselves, the echo chamber hypothesis. There's a hypothesis that they lead to radicalization because people are fighting with each other constantly, which is not the same as the echo chamber one. And then another hypothesis that argue that the biggest problem with social media is that it's discouraging political engagement. That's fine, all of these exist, and all of these also exist at the same time. I don't think we have a complete understanding. But in terms of policy demands, we are gravitating towards enhanced censorship, and we're doing it very rapidly. Now, our social media context is not the only one where forgetting is raised, and where the question of the established memory culture, where questions are raised about the established memory culture. Here's just a small group of scholars who have, just in recent years, very clearly called into question the efficacy, the desirability of cosmopolitan memory. Right? Arguments go, for example, Sarah Gensberger of France has argued that the cosmopolitan memory framework that we are embracing and practicing in so many institutions is actually dysfunctional because it creates a completely wrong link between values and behavior. Right? Behavior is situational, and a set of values like the one that Holocaust memory is embracing, where Holocaust memory, the memory of atrocities, is linked to the support for a human rights regime, and so that these kinds of value-driven memories are simply not functioning because human beings make their decisions much more situationally, which leads to the phenomenon we know very well, that people are great fans of cosmopolitan memory, but at the very same time they can support all kinds of violences. Right? There are other arguments being made against the memory regime of cosmopolitan memory, the argument being that it leads to all kinds of bizarre inequalities, especially between different victim groups. So it creates hierarchies, it makes hierarchies even worse, competition even worse than it would be without this kind of framework. And that's an important question we have to return to. Largely, maybe one of the most radical arguments is Valentina Pisanti's argument. She has forcefully suggested that some of our legal frameworks that especially we in Europe have embraced in order to institutionalize Holocaust memory, for example, the legal framework that puts under punishment the denial of the Holocaust, that this is one of the factors, and not a negligible factor, that has caused the rise of the right across Europe. So it's these punitive measures that have actually radicalized and mobilized the European right, who is partly in the business of dismantling cosmopolitan memory. So even from scholarly points of view, the paradigm is being questioned, and I would say quite successfully so. So what are we looking at here in terms of forgetting? So you look at the different, again I want to use different terms here. One of them is the term negative exposure by an expert of Chinese history and Chinese culture. Hillenbrand argues an interesting argument about the way that memory cultures replicate possibly precisely those elements we don't want to replicate, right? And here the question of violence and the graphicness of that violence comes back into the picture. So one of the questions we can raise about Holocaust memory is to what extent is revisiting the violence in graphic images actually setting benchmarks for the use of collective violence? So that by a process of negative exposure, all kinds of people, including all kinds of potential perpetrators, learn what a proper mass murder incident is by way of watching and consuming cosmopolitan memory. In the same way that perpetrators of school mass shootings learn what a proper school mass shooting is by watching other mass shooters in the media. Right? So that we're actually inadvertently reaching the opposite of what we want to by looking again and again into the center of these very violent events. Guy Biener, for example, studied Irish memory culture, has therefore suggested that a lot of a positive memory culture is finding the balance, finding a balance between memory and forgetting. So what we might need, what might be much more functional in terms of actually practicing what we preach in order to make the values that we embrace actually guide our actions, is to find ways of intelligent censorship, right? Democratic censorship. We're far away from that. But at the moment, censorship is practiced radically non-democratically. So the question is, I mean, all countries censor, of course, as they have to. And so in that sense, we have plenty of countries that have democratic rules of censorship. But these certainly don't apply to social media environment. So at the moment, the most radical, efficient censorship lacks democratic legitimacy. As I've pointed out, that applies to China and to Silicon Valley. Both of these places have no democratic legitimacy. So that seems to be one of the most important tasks for the immediate future. And then what we might need is what I would somewhat maybe provocatively call cosmopolitan forgetting. So cosmopolitan forgetting, how does that work? And I would want to point to one institution that I would say practices cosmopolitan forgetting. Right? That's the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. An edition opened in the early 2000s. And when it opened, 2004, 5, I think, if I remember correctly, when it opened, the critics were totally frustrated by that museum. Interestingly enough, only the non-indigenous critics were very frustrated. They were frustrated about two elements. They were frustrated first because the museum does not follow the standards of classification of objects that are established in Western academia. So the objects are labeled in ways that do not conform to the ways that non-indigenous researchers label them. That's really very frustrating to experts. The second frustration was, here the American indigenous population had received a huge amount of money, a fantastic platform, and the expectation was in the early 2000s that the indigenous population would now use that platform to create a cosmopolitan narrative about their own victimization, about how terrible everything has been since the people from Europe arrived. And the indigenous people who crafted that museum elegantly sidestepped that narrative and said, it's not our, we have nothing to do with that. Now, mass death, mass killing, massacres, they are acknowledged in the museum, in passing. They are there, the facts are not denied. But the museum is about something completely different. The museum is about creating a utopia that never existed, creating a utopia of a unified indigenous population in the Americas, and showcasing the culture, the indigenous culture, of hundreds and thousands of years of indigenous culture. So, no cosmopolitan memory here, right? And that's right next to the Holocaust Memorial Museum. That's cosmopolitan forgetting, I would argue, in many ways. That's a forgetting that empowers the community without focusing on the disasters that befell that community in the past. And we can, of course, argue about it if it's a good recipe or not, but it's an example of communities that have purposefully took distance from cosmopolitan memory. There seems to be, in this situation, again, very recent developments, also in Holocaust memory, the very question of the violence and going into the center of the violence is negotiated in new ways. There's always been in Holocaust memory that negotiation of going into the gas chambers or not, going visually into the gas chambers or not. And many people have argued there's, so to speak, a cultural taboo, and we have come closer and played with that taboo. That's maybe one of the reasons why we're lacking a video game about the Holocaust. But now you have established Holocaust memory institutions that are creating a memory of the Holocaust without any of the iconography of violence. So here, this is the Haus der Wannsee-Konferenz. So this is the building in Berlin where the organizational meeting took place about implementing the final solution. It was not the decision-making conference, but the building is therefore very important, and the building, this is one of the most recent exhibits about Holocaust history in all of Germany. And if you go through the exhibit, you notice that the whole exhibit is taking out of circulation the atrocity images, right? So we have now also, in light of these discussions, in light of the questions about the privacy of the people depicted on the atrocity images, questions a different sensibility about violence. We have now, for the first time, institutions of Holocaust memory that are sidestepping that violence. Interesting question is this now a project of forgetting? Or is this just temporary strategy because we know all these images all too well? What about people who don't know the images well? Raises intriguing questions about the future of Holocaust memory, I would argue. Now a cut that, because I find that I just want to add it into the mix because it complicates the picture further, right? We are looking, at the whole time we're looking at representations, we are looking how people are dealing with media. We can make the argument that in social media it's no longer traditional human actors that make decisions. Often enough, when it comes to social media, it's a combination of machine and human, and of algorithm and human that are making key decisions about memory. So in that sense, we are already looking at very, very different actors than the actors of the analog and electronic age. So even from between television and Facebook and television and TikTok, we're looking at different actors. But in all of these places, humans are still involved in the technology, in the media ecology that make up our memory. Here we're looking now at something very different, right? And the interesting thing is, we cannot yet talk about machine learning creating our visual media of memory because that doesn't work yet. Right? We don't yet have the technology to have the visual equivalent of GPT-3. So at the moment, we are linked to language. But we can look at these machines, right? And GPT-3 is an exception because it's publicly accessible. You can play with it, right? But GPT-3 is a language machine. So it's artificial intelligence that is creating language. And it has severe limitations, but at the same time, it has fantastic opportunities. And any of you who have played with the website, OpenAI, just have to register, then there's a playground and you can play with it. Anybody who's done that, I think, will be stunned by the abilities of this machine to create language that seems to be clearly human language, and absolutely is not. Right? These machines are fed with huge amounts of data, in this case language, and they answer one question, and they exist in many forms, and many other companies have them. OpenAI is just different from other companies because it has been open about the process, right? It used to be philanthropic, then it has changed to semi-commercial, but nevertheless it has been open all along. Similar machines exist from other platform providers, and they exist, for example, also in China. At the moment, experts would argue the most advanced large language model, that's what they're called, the most advanced is the Chinese. But what is so fantastic about these machines are that on the basis of having digested huge amounts of language, They write you texts. And they do it by answering one question again and again. You give a certain input, a sentence, two, can be longer. You have certain parameters, and then the machine very quickly has output by answering the question, what is the most likely next word? What is the most likely next word? Judged statistically by the input that these machines have digested. And the result is very human-sounding texts. Now, there are lots of problems with the machines. From a historical point of view, first and foremost, and also I would say from a memory point of view. First of all, these machines have no sense of accuracy, absolutely none. Right? It's a probability. So it's statistics. They can write texts that seem accurate, but they're not accurate. They are often based, statistically, the accurateness is reflecting the accurateness of the text that they have gobbled up. But even then, there is no guarantee for that. So these texts, these machines lie, and they lie systematically. Right? That's one of them. The next one is, these machines cannot trace where pieces of information are coming from, because they're not taking them from a specific place. They have no clue where they're coming from. They can't write footnotes. They can simulate footnotes. They can do that. You can ask the machine to write an academic text, and it creates a footnote. But the footnote is invented. It looks plausible, but it's invented. Right? So there is no vertical memory in this machine. Right? That's, I would say, also highly problematic. So, and that's linked to the fact what has been used to feed these machines, right? These, I would say, Common Crawl is a highly problematic source because it's just what is found on the internet, right? A lot of it is just, or Reddit, for example, is a big chunk of material that has been used here. So that's why it's so highly problematic. But think about the possibilities. You know, think about the possibilities. Let's say, for example, for the Chinese LLM, large language model. It's a fantastic opportunity because now, depending on how you feed the machine, certain topics, certain ideas are even more likely to completely disappear from circulation. So we're looking here at an even much more advanced possibility of censorship. We can talk about how one could change that. You have to have accurate feed, for example, to change it. Also, what you would need is an archive that traces. You need to splice together accurate feed with archival information. Only then could you possibly have a large language model that can responsibly create history, and I would say also responsibly create memory. And even then, these machines are always inherently conservative. They reflect what they have digested. You know, creative leaps of imagination are not what these machines are made for. But they are already part of our world. All of us are inundated by language that is not human created. It's already part of many of our social media consumption is already linked to texts that are created by this way. And now imagine the next step. Because the next step is, at some point, we don't have the computing power at the moment, but the next step is, think about this in terms of images. Think about, you know, on-demand documentaries that are created by way of large visual archive models. Right, where you put in and say, I would like to have a documentary about Hitler in the years from, in the style of Ken Burns, and then a few minutes afterwards you have that documentary, you watch it, you go to bed, right? So that's going to happen. It's a question of time. It's not that it's not going to happen. So we increasingly are in this situation where artificial intelligence will produce, by way of language already does, but by way of images will in the future, as documentary, as fiction, will produce our memory. Visually, it already does that in a lot of video games, because artificial intelligence is fabulous at connecting different scenes. So you're coding a scene in a game, you're coding another scene in the game, then you can tell the machine of connecting the two. And in that sense, a lot of the background information, the background visuals of video games are already produced by artificial intelligence. So so in these environments, the question of forgetting will become even more important. And I think more important for us to try to find an answer quickly. So I think some of the key questions, some of the most interesting questions we have at the moment is what are actually the limits of these kinds of atrocity memories that we have? What do they do well? What do they not do well? How is anti-Semitism and racism linked? How inclusive is Holocaust memory as we practice it? Right? Was this initial hope that Holocaust memory will help us to put into practice human rights, will help us to fight racism, is that transfer? Has that ever worked? Did it perhaps work in 2015-16 in some places during the so-called refugee crisis? Is it working now with regard to the war in Ukraine? Are we trying to be humane and welcoming refugees because we have digested the lessons of Holocaust memory? Or alternatively, is Holocaust memory actually a disturbingly white memory that makes integration much more difficult than it otherwise would be? Right? Those are some of the key questions that we have to try to find answers to, which creates a lot of the discussions just in the last moments. I don't know how many of you have followed the discussion about Documenta in Kassel, but this is what this is about. This is what it is about. It's all this question, how do we position ourselves vis-a-vis other people, right? How exclusive is Holocaust memory? Dare I say, how racist is Holocaust memory? Right? Now, so the question is, what should take its place? And is it atrocity? Is the memory of atrocities what should take its place? Or is it the memory of a utopia that never existed that should take its place, if you follow the American Indians, for example, right? How much radicalization is actually digitally charged? Right? It's an empirical question. I don't think we have yet a clear answer to that question. And then, of course, maybe the last question, how do we teach machines to create the type of memory that we think we need? In the end of this, there might be a lot of hope. There might be a lot of hope, because there's this one hope is that humankind has been very bad at translating cosmopolitan memory into a preemptive memory of the climate catastrophe that allows us to remember the catastrophe before it happens to prevent it, right? That's a memory that turns time upside down. Humans have not been very good at that. So far, we always create memories after the catastrophes, and in this case, creating a memory after the catastrophe is itself a catastrophe, right? So maybe, just maybe, machines are actually much better at following, understanding cosmopolitan memory, are much better at putting it into practice because they're consistent. And machines are much more consistent. So maybe we can teach machines what kind of things we have to forget in the present. Right? For example, climate change denial. A machine can make it disappear. Can absolutely make it disappear, and at the same time, these machines can create all kinds of stories, preaching the need for a changed behavior, for changing us as consumers. So there might be the hope that machines are much, much better at cosmopolitan values and cosmopolitan memory than humans ever were. That's the moment of hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wulf. As previously, I was not only able to follow, but became shattered. And and perhaps you have posed some of the questions I wanted to pose myself by the very end. But still there's a lot of space, not only in the upcoming 25 minutes, or even more, but there would be a lot of space once again during the workshop on Friday, where we can definitely get to a more focused view based on one of your key texts and try to revise it. But let's open the floor to your questions. If you don't mind, please, could you say your name first, and it might contain a comment as well, but I would prefer it to be phrased as a question to Wulf. I'll take just one question at a time, and you might either prefer to pose it in English or Czech. That's just up on you. Right, so there's a first question over there by Andrea.
Hello everyone, thank you so much, Wulf, for a very inspiring talk. I enjoyed it a lot. Still, I feel that my mind will just blow, so it will be kind of chaotically phrased. I have actually two questions for you. The first is related with the first part of your presentation. When you were actually talking about this kind of game-changing moment of emergence of television, for the way how we consume, how we participate, how we project into the historical events that's being put on a screen. But also, completely at the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about the first Reconstruction era of the first decade after the Second World War, which we know was the boom of documentary cinema and cinema going. So, you know, at least in Czechoslovakia, there were like, in the first 10 years after the war, there were like almost, you know, doubled the numbers of cinemas. Cinemas were also in small cities. So my first question is, have you considered the different point of view or different type of spectatorship when people were watching the atrocities of Holocaust and Second World War as a collective event, which was the social event, which were taking place in a cinema, which was embodied way of viewing and appropriating the images of Holocaust and other atrocities. And then the way of watching the same images in this disembodied kind of way, when you are not participating. It's not a social and collective event, it's more like ritualized everyday events. So we are like at that moment collecting different types of situations or discourse or dispositives for viewing. So this is my question. The same pictures have been seen or had been seen at time, but in different dispositive, social, media, etc. Including like our body experience. This is my first question, if you can elaborate on that a little bit. And then the second question, it was pretty interesting, and thank you so much for talking about these interesting scholars who are now talking about questioning the framework of cosmopolitan memory. And my suggestion is, should we link this kind of this moment of questioning the framework of collective, cosmopolitan memory with the digitization, with this heavy digitization, large ongoing digitization of local materials. We have digital local memory nowadays, you know, we have a great funding, we have a great tools, we have even digitized our personal memories, our personal archival source, some local, regional support for museums, NGOs, communities is going on. So at that moment, we have to question the cosmopolitan framework, as we have a tools nowadays through which regional, personal, and community memory can emerge. So we are in the process or in the stage of diversification of mediascapes through which different types of newly digitized materials can circulate in comparison to more homogeneous and monolithic of circulating the sources of the past. Yeah, and I have much more, but this is good. I will stick to this. I will provide other space, and thank you again. It was inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. You're perfectly right, of course, of the existence of a cinematic dispositif in the post-war decades and being very successful, but perhaps because of timing, perhaps of other factors, it is not the cinematic dispositif that is actually creating cosmopolitan memory. You know, first of all, you have, you could argue there is too much focus and there's a lack of focus. There is a, you know, the type of circulation, media circulation in the immediate post-war years is taking place in narrative frameworks that are providing meaning, and it's always, as you know, the combination of images and narrative that creates meaning, right? I mean, the image texts is the one that creates memory. It's not images in and of itself, it's often, I would say, also in the 20th century, not narrative by themselves, it's the combination of the two. And the frameworks, the frameworks in circulation and in use after 45 and the decades after the war were, for example, not frameworks that allowed for the Holocaust to appear as the Holocaust, right? I mean, you have, of course, you have the same images that are already used in Nuremberg, but from Nuremberg emerges, Nuremberg is part of a war crime narrative. It's not part of a genocide narrative, despite the fact that the term genocide, of course, is then created in the very same context. But it simply doesn't create yet. And some people would argue maybe the narrowing in the 70s was actually a problem for a human rights agenda. But the cinematic dispositif doesn't seem to create, the second thing it's missing is the self-critical turn. You know, the relatively radical self-critical turn is apparently at that point not facilitated by cinema. Now the problem then is when the self-critical turn happens, cinema is in some ways at least waning, quite drastically, some people have argued is dying. But the self-critical turn is emerging in this bizarre communicative setting of the television, right? You are at home, you're, so to speak, you have this combination of violence, in the German case, violence perpetrated by one's self, and you're watching this in the safety and comfort of your home, in this kind of what I would call a bystander setting. And it seems to be that that combination was important in facilitating the self-critical turn, yeah? Where you are looking back and you're looking at your own crimes. A lot of the cinema of the post-war years, I would argue, happens in narrative frames where you're looking at the crimes of others, right? I mean, that's in the communist key, you're looking at the crimes of others. In the anti-totalitarian key, you're looking at the crimes of others. So that self-critical turn, the self-critical turn, the Allies hoped that they could induce, especially the Americans were hoping that with these kind of visual shock therapy, they could induce a self-critical turn, but that failed. It didn't happen. So in that sense, of course it's very important to argue that cinema laid the foundation for what came on television. Also because the cinematic images were then, you know, recycled again and again. Right? They become part of that paradigm later on. In a different key, but I think it's the television setting, the television dispositif that makes the difference in some important ways. There's another element we should not discount, very simple one. The self-critical and self-reflexive turn is a turn that happens in extremely wealthy societies, right? That simply wasn't the case, you know. So there are all numbers, all kinds of factors that are very important. Another factor is a very simple factor. The emergence of color television. Right? In the German setting, Holocaust was one of the true, you know, Hollywood-made fast cut for then standards, color television event. Right? So you know, that immersive element of color shouldn't be discounted. So it's all kinds of rather coincidental factors, which also explains why this has never been repeated. what happens in digital culture and Holocaust memory at the moment points in very different direction. It's extremely dynamic. There are a lot of Holocaust memory institutions that are now embarking and investing heavily in digital presence and digital media, but I think their presence is often linked to a sense of keeping control of the message. That might or might not work, but it's very important for them. I would argue, somewhat provocatively, a lot of established Holocaust memory institutions use social media as broadcasting devices. They want to keep the message stable, right? And whenever you also look at how does interactivity actually work, so to what extent do these institutions allow all kinds of users to change the message actively, then you see that they're discouraging that. So there is a lot of censorship happening when it comes to people using creatively, maybe also irresponsibly, the offerings that Holocaust institutions provide. So at the moment, it's not quite clear yet, I think, where the creative power is, but there's a lot of desire to keep controlling it. And that applies to commercial places, but it applies also to all the key institutions of Holocaust memory, both using it and very nervous about it. So I don't see the mobilization quite yet. That already exists in other topics. I don't see it happening yet in the Holocaust setting. That's all.
Thank you. May I ask for another question? Josef Ripka, perhaps, if you don't mind, Josef, I'll take the liberty to follow up on what Wulf just said and ask my own question. And it is, you're using a lot of strong language, especially when it comes to censorship and the cultural environment in Central and Eastern Europe. Like everyone is aware of the classical shape of censorship. Your argument goes so that, at least partially, that against the problem with who is to decide what to censor and what not, which makes the censorship so problematic, goes your practical view that someone is already censoring. But my question would be, you're translating moderation or cultivation or whatever term is more acceptable for the public to censorship, more or less mainly for epistemological reasons, like that it's more direct, or is there a value-laden perspective? Are you saying censorship also because either you want to be clear or you want the value-laden part to be seen as well?
I think, let's call a spade, right? I mean, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that censorship has always existed and censorship can be legitimate. I think that's very important. But the question is, where does the legitimacy come from? And at the moment, we are in an unbearable situation that the censorship is highly centralized and outside of democratic control in most institutions that count. Yes, so absolutely. I would see that the questions of censorship are so important because they're all about values, because they're all about ethics. They're all about the question, who gets to speak, who gets to change the message, and who is allowed to change key messages and who is not allowed to change key messages. I would argue at the moment we are, many of the decisions or many of the demands are demands that seem to fly in the face of one of the key values and key mechanisms that we assumed are the backbone of democratic societies. and that's free speech, right? So at the moment, that's what needs to be balanced. And I think we need to have very good reasons to balance it, and we need to have very explicit discussions about it, how we would like to organize that balance and who's making that decision. At the moment, we're looking at the situation where we have lots of ad hoc decisions all the time, spontaneously being made, also often, by the way, locally, right? So that local actors in Holocaust memory, they are on digital platforms, and they are forced to, right? They're also forced by the law to make decisions. So I recently talked to people who are, Bergen-Belsen is one of the memory sites in Germany that's very active online, and I asked him, how do you make those decisions? How do you make the decision that this is a comment that's out of line and this is a comment that's acceptable? The practice is whoever is on duty. Whoever is on duty makes that decision. They all have staffing problems, and there is one person reading this and saying, oh my God, this could be a problem for us, let's make it disappear. So we are lacking policy, we are lacking reflection, we are lacking legitimacy for these absolutely decisive questions. I don't know if that answered your question.
Great, thank you.
Actually, I'll pick up on the very same topic. And I was wondering, when you're speaking about forgetting the past and this orchestrated sort of forgetting in censorship, so I was wondering whether you distinguish different genres of forgetting. For example, and I'm thinking of French philosopher and theologist Olivier Habel, who speaks of amnesty and forgiveness as a sort of forgetting that's sometimes necessary. You can think of, for example, Western Balkans, when obviously some kind of forgetting will be necessary in near future, otherwise it will get better in the region. So maybe that's my first question about like different genres of forgetting, when you distinguish them. And then in my second question, I just when I was listening to speaking about all these movements and NGOs meddling with memory, like Facebook meddling with censoring anti-vaxxers and Fridays for Futures dealing with climate deniers, and I was wondering whether we are still speaking of memory here, because these these organizations and these agendas, they are more about outright lying, and we could also speak of propaganda, because there are obviously power and money interest behind these, some of these, for example, behind climate deniers, you could say. So, and I'm just hesitating, to put all these directions into this, pile of meddling with memory, because they are not really dealing with past. So, maybe I was wondering what's your thoughts on this, and thank you for your thought-provoking lecture.
I start with the last one. I absolutely, of course, I'm very aware of the fact that that's precisely one of the shifts I would argue is part of our moment, that what constitutes pasts is changing, and what constitutes relevant pasts is changing. And that's part of that is linked to time. One very simple argument in all this mix, one could argue is, hey, we are more than 3 generations now away from this catastrophe. What does it still have to tell us, right? So the transition from communicative to cultural memory, as Jan Assmann would phrase it, is perhaps also the moment of where forgetting takes place and where it should take place. But so in that sense, we are probably looking at a situation where we also can't avoid the forgetting. Now, the different genres of forgetting. David Reeve has argued in his controversial book that any kind of decent society has to have a decent measure of forgetting, otherwise it's no longer a decent society. That's maybe a kind of simplistic argument, but that might be what we're looking at. We might be looking at a kind of a loop of the reproduction of violence, where our memory culture has accomplished one thing and one thing only. We have accomplished a culture that does not allow us to engage in mass violence without memory. So we have mass violence and we memorialize it almost immediately, right? We have all kinds of institutions that do that. What we don't seem to have accomplished is no mass violence, right? So a lot of our memorial culture seems to be quite efficient at memorializing violence, but perhaps partially also inducing it, despite the fact that we are embedding it in a from a critical point of view. So in that sense, the question of forgiveness and the question of amnesia is of course important. Now, on an individual level, purposeful forgetting doesn't work. You can't purposefully forget on an individual level. But as Umberto Eco has argued, on a collective level you can. On a collective level, these kinds of decisions, what are you taking out of circulation, are actually decisions that work. Not because we are inducing collectives to forget things they've already known, but we are creating collectives that have never known the things we want them to not remember. So in that sense, the question is technically quite relevant. Yeah, I hope did I answer your second question? I'm not sure if I did it properly.
I guess you did.
What?
I guess you did.
Okay.
Great, so we have time for like 3 more questions perhaps, if they're not too long, or double this time. Great, so Jack.
Picha, thank you very much for your interesting and provocative speech. I would like to ask, like to the last part of your speech, to the appendix, if you are speaking about the AI and about the machines, do you perceive them like the agents or like the active actors in the process of remembering? Because you are speaking about the memory of the machines or about them like in the active way, but in the same time, you know, and you are mentioning it that we have to teach them, or we have to train them. So it's possible in these conditions to speak about something like memory of the machines, or how do you perceive the role like of the AI, like the subject in the process of remembering?
I think in almost all of these cases we're looking at hybrids. We're looking at agency that is quite differently constituted from the type of agency that has crafted the parameters of our memory culture conventionally, right? And so in that sense, the shift, I think, is quite decisive. Now, hybridity, there's always the interaction of human and media ecology. So in that sense, we have always been partially scripted by the technologies of communication we are using. But I would argue there's a decisive shift, for example, in terms of centralization, the centralization that is very clearly at issue in the 20th century, where communicative power was so highly centralized. And I think now the interesting part is that we're looking at this twofold, I mean, highly local in one way and highly centralized on the other hand. And in some ways we can embrace visions and fantasies about human agency, where humans, so to speak, are still in charge of the algorithms. But at the same time, that's completely, I think, unrealistic, because so many decisions about content are now already being made. You know, so many seconds are already made by artificial intelligence, and some of that is quite difficult to predict. I think the moment you start playing with these machines, you realize you can't replicate it, right? I mean, the same input produces different output at different points in time. You have to analyze a lot of it to realize to what extent is this all homogeneous or not. Structurally, there is a frightening homogeneity in these machines. But in terms of concrete output, there isn't. So also as consumers, we are fooled again and again and again. We are assuming that this is something new, and we are consuming it as something new. So I think, even understanding that agency properly will take some time. But it's not the type of traditional human agency that we like to imagine when we look at culture. Right? That's very clear. So in that sense, it's something other than human words that we are encountering. And I think one shouldn't forget that inbuilt into it, even if we are fooled, but inbuilt into it are structural interests. And at the moment, those are commercial and political interests. So very important commercial interests that make this technology be used in different settings. The law, for example, legal settings, is already used all the time. And political, because they're fantastic machines they are fantastic machines of control. And that's what I think we are already seeing quite live in, for example, Chinese society. So in that sense, agency, yes, yeah, there's some human left somewhere, but that human element doesn't seem to be in control, maybe not even of itself, right? So that's a tricky issue.
Thank you. The gentleman in the grey shirt. And perhaps if there's one more, last one. Great.
Hello, my name is Maciej, and thank you for the lecture. And I was wondering about the question, which type of technology which we use to develop. So, because you talk about technology as one homogeneous phenomenon, but I think that technology is, there are many types of technologies. Yeah, for example, capitalist technologies like Facebook, which is not like a technology, neutral technology, but capitalist technology which aim is exploit capital from society. So, yeah, that's my question.
Absolutely, I think that's precisely the point. The point is that different media ecologies have different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to their memorial functions. So maybe to make that argument even clearer, what I find so intriguing about the television technology and the television dispositif is that it has a blind spot. And the blind spot is the bystanding, right? Television technology is the dispositif that allows the bystanders of the crimes to construct themselves as passive, and that passivity is doubled in the very active phase of the construction of meaning of the past. So in that sense, television is then pointing focusing, allowing the societies, the post-war societies, to focus on victims and perpetrators, and in some cases also on heroes. But it basically skirts the whole issue of bystanding, the question of complicity, the question that Michael Rothberg would call the question of the implicated subject. Right? And I think in principle, a lot of the extremely diverse digital media, they are actually much better at raising self-reflexively the question of complicity, the question of bystanding. So for example, if you create media environments, virtual reality environments, where you are walking through landscapes of violence as, you know, so to speak, as a bystander figure, then you have a completely different appreciation of the complexities of making decisions. You have a completely different experience in your digital self of being implicated in the violence than you have it when you're watching television in your home. Right? So in that sense, I would say that technology is in principle very capable of raising to awareness the experience of bystanding as an active deed, as complicit, as implicated. Right? So we have here opportunities that we haven't used yet. That's also why we can't completely step away from it. We have to develop these questions systematically. But probably it requires fundamental answers first. And for example, a fundamental question is, do we want to go there? So do we want to create the kind of virtual environment where we are immersing ourselves in situations of extreme violence, maybe as observers, but implicated, where we experience our decisions and the consequences of our decisions. So the consequence, for example, of not helping others, what does it do to us? So do we want to experience these kinds of conundrums, moral conundrums, very stressful experiences? Or is that actually the wrong way to go? Do we need to create virtual environments that are actually allowing us to avoid those types of extremely stressful situations? It's a fundamental question about the purpose of dark memory. You know, we have hope that dark memory works as a progressive force. Does it do that? You know, if we go that way, then our responsibility is to create that type of disturbing experience. Try to explore how can we handle it, who can handle it, what age group can handle it. That raises in a whole slew of didactic questions. We are already doing it. You know, people are already immersing themselves in very violent environments. We are hoping for the best, but we are lacking actually the kind of data to also understand what does it do to people actually in the long run when they are playing violent games. Most research says they're not likely to become more violent. But you know, is that true? The whole discussions about censorship work on a different assumption. That assumption is that what you are, at least to a certain share, you are what you consume, right? And that question we haven't quite settled yet. That's where we need to find a way, and maybe we need to find it by way of responsible experiments and making that decision, or maybe we also have to find it by changing tact, going back and forth on this. But I think we probably need a sense. We need a sense of what can we responsibly impose on people as a larger and larger share of their lives will be experienced virtually. Right? That's so. In essence, it's the question. In our real lives, we were convinced that dark memory is a good force. Does that apply to our virtual lives as well or not? That's, I think, one of the essential questions we have to try to come to terms with.
Thank you very much. Since I have indicated one more question, if that might be a very short one, or perhaps if you're joining the Friday's workshop, are you? You're not? Okay. So would you mind posing it in a dense way?
Don't have a microphone, hope you do. I'm Philip Herza.
I'm Philip Herza. My question concerns the global dimension of thinking about memory. And I think one of the vital questions that you raised is that that we need to look for a democratic ways of censorship and of forgetting. And you also mentioned China, and you also mentioned the movement of indigenous people behind this museum in the States. So my question would be, is there like source of inspirations beyond Europe that we can inspire us from? Also in terms of dealing with technology, using technology, right?
That's an extremely good question. Some of the negotiations, as is normally taking place, the US is a very important player here. So questions, how are these questions negotiated in the United States are very important because some of the key players are there. And we are often looking for decisions there to try to figure out how decisions are made in a semi-transparent and semi-democratic way. And therefore, the American answer is to throw these questions to the legal system. You know, as you see at the moment, you see it in the last years, and you see this stunning turnaround, right? The stunning turnaround. I mean, I think we cannot overemphasize what this means for American society to have dislodged, undermined. You can argue, if you want to, or simply pushed aside the principle of free speech. Right? The classical definition of free speech, which has shielded not journalists, by the way, from responsibility, right? The journalists are kind of an exception, but has shielded so many commercial entities from responsibility for the type of opinions and the type of messages that they're putting into circulation. I think you can't overemphasize what this means for American society, the Sandy Hook decisions. So in that sense, in America, these questions are negotiated in the legal system. Now that doesn't make me very hopeful, because we also know that the American legal system has been under tremendous pressure, and that at least the Supreme Court in the United States is highly dysfunctional at the moment. So that might not be a good place to negotiate these things. But de facto, that's where the decisions are being made. In Europe, it's a little different. It's a different legal framework, and therefore we are here looking at the EU as the player. I'm hoping for the best, but I'm worrying to what extent the announcements that have come from Brussels are actually being put into practice. And one of the decisive questions will be, and we will not have that decision in the United States anytime soon, one of the decisive questions will be to lay bare, to open, to make transparent the type of coding, the type of algorithms that are governing the large platforms, right? And as long as that transparency is not reached, we have a problem. And if any player at the moment can accomplish that, it's actually the European Union. And the European Union is powerful enough to make also the players in America change their platforms, because so many consumers are here. So at the moment, I think that's kind of perhaps the best hope we have, other than hoping that China becomes a very different society, right? That would be absolutely fascinating, because I'm convinced that some of the most advanced technologies and some of the most advanced inter-platform links, they're actually created in China at the moment. So the questions I'm trying to be optimistic. Look, it's also a question of values. If you play devil's advocate, right? The moment China, with the existing power structure, decides that it will put everything, make all decisions in favor of saving the climate, the likelihood that it happens is much higher and this is the single most important player in terms of size and in terms of power. Right? So maybe an anecdote at the end here. When you travel from China to Taiwan, right? At the moment travel that would be very difficult to do. But one of the things you notice is in China, in the large cities, you don't have motor-driven bikes any longer, mopeds. They don't exist. They're all, even the oldest construction is run by electricity in most big cities. In Taipei, it's still, fossil fuel burning mopeds. So when China makes decisions of changing tact, like China will be the largest producer of electric vehicles, or already is the largest producer in the world. So when China makes these kinds of decisions and enforcing them, things change, and they change very rapidly. They don't change in the same speed in Europe, and they certainly don't in the United States. So the ironies might be that our hope for climate stability is the success of the Chinese dictatorship. That's a very sobering thought, isn't it?
Right. I hope and suppose that there's kind of no one in the room, no doubting that there are issues in global memory. They are somehow connected to Holocaust. They are very much connected and related to technologies. And they are kind of touching our everyday lives. They are very relevant. thank you for such a powerful set of arguments that make our conference legitimate now.